All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for another exciting webinar. My name is Karina. I'm the receptionist at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, and I'll be your host today. And we're here to learn about gardening for butterflies other than monarchs in Western Oregon and Washington with Emma Pelton. Emma is the Endangered Species Conservation Biologist and Western Monarch Lead at the Xerces Society. Welcome, Emma.
Thank you so much, Karina, and thank you all for being here. I'm excited to talk to you today about gardening for butterflies besides monarchs west of the Cascades. So if you're not familiar with us, the Xerces Society is a science-based nonprofit. We're based in Portland, Oregon, but we have staff throughout the United States. And we engage in education, outreach, applied research, policy, and restoration to protect invertebrates and their habitat. This is our staff photo from an annual meeting 2 years ago. And our main conservation programs are pollinator conservation, endangered species, which is the program that I am in, pesticides, and community engagement that helped organize these webinars. And donors make our work possible. We're a donor-supported nonprofit, so if you're able, thank you for considering becoming a member today. So about me and my work, on the photo on the left is hiking on Orcas Island in the San Juans this past fall, and on the right is our COVID reality world of fieldwork. I'm doing pollinator surveys up in Forest Park in Portland in April. So my main job is focusing on Western monarch conservation, but I enjoy dabbling a lot of other insects. So this will be a really fun change for me today to talk about butterflies besides monarchs. I live and work in Portland, although I do a lot of work in California with the overwintering sites for monarchs. And I'm a new homeowner, so I'm learning to garden for butterflies right alongside you. And I hope I'll be able to answer your questions, but I'm also amazed with how much I'm learning by just getting my hands dirty in the past year I've had a house. And I also relate to anyone who's renting, as I rented for my entire adult life until last year. So trying to get creative about doing something good for pollinators, even if you move a lot or have a small space to work with. So a brief interlude. That monarch on the front is the only monarch photo. No, maybe that's not totally true. I tried to limit my monarch photos, but that's what I'm used to. So why aren't we talking about monarchs today? Well, this is a map of the migration and the summer breeding grounds of monarchs throughout the lower 48 states and into southern Canada. And if we zoom in on our area of the Pacific Northwest, I would say we probably need to update this graphic a little bit, but broadly it shows the areas where milkweed historically has not occurred. So that includes most of the Cascades, the Coast Range in Oregon, and then up once you get into really Washington west of the Cascades and Vancouver. I would say that that doesn't mean there are zero monarchs. There are definitely some monarchs. I've seen monarchs in Portland and a little further north. We occasionally get reports, even up into BC, but overall, those are infrequent visitors. So that limited milkweed distribution, infrequent visitation of monarchs are both reasons why we think this is a great area to focus a lot of our efforts on things that help more than just monarchs. And there are so many other great butterflies we could be supporting. So I love people's enthusiasm for monarchs, but sometimes it's worthwhile to harness that energy to think about all of these other species that we're a lot more likely to be able to see and support in our yards. And also I talk about monarchs all the time, so this is a nice break. So we're gonna do some polls. If you are on your computer and you're able to, I'm gonna bring up this first poll. Karina, just double checking, can you see this?
I can see your presentation, but not the poll.
But not the poll, okay. Let me try this. This is my first time doing the poll, so please stick with me. All right, looks like we've got a lot of people that have voted. So most people that replied live in the Portland or Vancouver area, with a lot of folks also in the Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia area. I recognize that that's a large area lumped together. Also got some Olympic Peninsula, Willamette Valley, Bellingham, Southern Oregon, and a fair number of you who are not from an area listed. So that's helpful. I think that those areas listed, particularly Willamette Valley and North, are kind of the main focus of this webinar, but I hope any of you, despite where you live, that there will be some good take-home messages. All right, so our second poll. Oh, I did this opposite, I'm sorry. We're going back to poll one. This one is going to be, what are you most interested in? What are you most interested in learning about today? Types of flowers or nectar plants, types of host plants, the species of butterflies you can expect to attract, pesticides, all of them, or you're not sure yet and you're just here to learn. All right, we've got a lot of people that have participated, so I'm going to end the poll, and it looks like all of the above, and in particular, people are interested in the types of flowers and nectar plants that they should plant and the types of host plants. That's really good to know. That'll help me kind of hone how much time I spend on each of these sections. Okay. So that is the end of our polling for now. We'll have another question near the end, but thanks for participating. And if there's just a few things that you take home for today, I really want that to be that creating gardens for butterflies is fun and easy. And if you plant it, they will find it. And if they don't, if you're focused on a specific species and you don't have success attracting them to your yard, I think it's worthwhile to think about all the other great insects and other wildlife that you're supporting. I know I take solace in this when I have my showy milkweed planted in my front yard that's beautiful and blooming right now. And on my way in here today, I saw that a honeybee was nectaring. So I may not have monarchs, but I'm supporting other bees and butterflies with the work that I do in my garden. And I hope that everyone can find that as well. And butterflies are insects, so please eliminate or reduce your use of insecticides, both in your gardens and in your yard, whenever possible. And that gardens really can make a difference. We're going to talk a bit at the beginning about the dire state of insects and butterflies, and I know that can be quite depressing, but I really think the good news is that we can all be part of that solution. So remembering that whatever you do, even if you only have a small pot you can put out on a stoop, that you can make a difference. So why do butterflies matter? My guess is if you're tuning in, you may have your own ideas of why butterflies matter. But to think about it a little more broadly, butterflies are incredibly diverse. There are over 160 species of Lepidoptera, which is the group of insects that make up butterflies and moths worldwide. And they're found on every continent except Antarctica, and are found in a wide variety of habitats. They're pollinators. They play a significant role in the pollination of flowering plants. Bees are far superior typically because they're collecting pollen for their young, but butterflies and moths are also important pollinators. And because especially some of our larger bodied butterflies like swallowtails and monarchs have really strong wings and can travel quite far, they may also be really important when we think about plants and long distance pollen transfer. They're also important as food for other animals, especially when they're caterpillars. They're a major source of food for insectivorous birds, which we know represent about 70% of our songbirds. And we can really link a decline of our songbirds with a decline in insects. So if you want to support birds, thinking about plants and animals in your yard, plants and insects in your yard is a great way to think about bird conservation. There's also an economic factor. Butterfly ecotourism generates millions of dollars annually. And I know this firsthand from work in California, where I work down at Pismo Beach. Pacific Grove are both cities that are kind of coined as butterfly towns, and people come in huge numbers, tens of thousands, if not 100,000 people per year to see the incredible migration of monarchs. This is very much true in Mexico, where the overwintering sites are for the eastern population of butterflies. And it's even true in places like this, a butterfly pavilion in Colorado, and butterfly houses associated with zoos and botanical gardens and other things like that. So the status of North American butterflies is what I'm going to talk about next. This is where I think it's worthwhile to both marvel at the diversity and think about the threats facing them. There are over 11,000 Lepidoptera species in just Canada and the US alone, and 800 of them are butterfly species. This is kind of true across the board. It's kind of an interesting quirk of evolution, but there always seems to be about an order of magnitude more moth species than there are butterfly species in any given place. And of those 800 butterfly species, about 200 are native to the Pacific Northwest. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to be using the term native and non-native to describe both insects and plants. And just want to point out that that's not something that we think about from an anthropomorphic value system, but we're thinking about plants and animals that evolved in the places where they're currently found, and they co-evolve usually with the host plants that they evolved on. But a lot of animals are adaptable and can start to use non-native introduced plants. So when we use those terms, that's what we're talking about. And butterflies are in decline. I won't go into detail for most of these studies, but the takeaway is that in diverse studies from the UK to Ohio to California to Mexico, we're seeing declines of both specialist and generalist butterflies. And it's not just butterflies. Wherever it's studied, the diversity, abundance, and biomass of insects and other invertebrates is decreasing, and this is making a lot of headlines. So people are becoming more aware of this phenomenon. And similar to all insects, the major threats to butterflies are habitat loss and pesticides. So this includes habitat loss in our rural areas by how we farm, and also in our urban and exurban areas by how we develop, how we manage landscapes. So it's not any one group of people's problem, it's all of our problems about how we manage our landscapes and make sure that there's room for wild animals. Pesticides are also a big factor, both in agriculture and in how we manage mosquitoes and in how we manage our lawns and gardens. Climate change is another factor. This is a beautiful photo by Robert Michael Pyle, who's the founder of Xerces, of the island marble butterfly, which just received listing 20 years after it was first petitioned by the Xerces Society. It's found on the San Juan Islands, and it's now down to just a single location. So it's really in critical need for protection. So we're really excited that it's become listed, but it's, you know, a perfect example of an animal that's already suffering because of habitat loss, and now climate change is an added stressor. The good news is that you can be part of the solution, and I think that's really a powerful part of our work here at Xerces, is that there are these larger forces we hear about, insect declines, and you don't exactly know how you can help, you know, change climate change on a large scale. None of us individually can do that. So we all try to do our small part. So I really like to view that as gardening as part of that solution and something really proactive and a great thing to be doing right now when a lot more of us are at home due to COVID. Now we're going to get into recognizing butterflies and what they need and how you can help them. So telling the difference between a moth and a butterfly can sometimes be tricky. The old adage that day flying means butterfly and night flying means moth doesn't hold true with our many day flying moth species. So better ways to tell the two groups apart are their wing position. When they're flying, this isn't as helpful, but when they've landed, butterflies generally hold their wings partially open or closed vertically over their bodies. You think about a monarch that's closed vertically, or this painted lady in the lower photograph is partially open. And then that upper photograph shows those wings flat, which is typical of moths. Another characteristic is antennae. Butterflies have a single filament with a club tip, which you can also see in that photo of the painted lady. Whereas a moth, if it's a male, it's frequently broad and feathery. They're using that to actually pick up pheromones of females. So they're very characteristic feathery antennae. Or if it's a female, it's going to just be a single filament, somewhat like a butterfly, but it'll be lacking that club tip. So the butterfly life cycle begins as an egg, which a female adult butterfly lays on or near the host plant. And the host plant is the species of plant that an animal needs to survive. So for caterpillars, that can sometimes mean, you know, one specific type of plant. In the case of monarchs, that means milkweeds. But as we'll learn today, there are some butterflies that use a wide range of host plants. That egg hatches into a caterpillar, also known as a larva, which can grow up to 30 times in just 2 to 3 weeks, go through multiple molts where it sheds its exoskeleton, become larger. And finally, it pupates and forms a chrysalis, where it completes metamorphosis into the winged adult. And then that adult continues the life cycle for the next generation, where they're seeking out nectar for energy, host plants to lay eggs on, and mates. There are 5 major butterfly families. Include skippers, swallowtails, whites and sulfurs, gossamer wings, and the brush-footed butterflies. So just briefly to familiarize yourself so you can impress your friends and tell them you know what sort of butterfly you've seen in the garden. Skippers tend to be very small butterflies. They're usually brown or orange-brown. They tend to be low-flying. A lot of them use grasses as their host plant. And they often form their wings in a very characteristic V shape. So instead of having them flat or fully closed, the hind wing and the forewing are kind of at a slight angle to each other, and that looks like a V from the side. If you look carefully, their tips of their antennae are also hooked. So there's not just clubbed, but they actually have a small hook. Swallowtails are our largest butterflies. This includes Anna's swallowtail, western swallowtail, pale swallowtail, all species that I've seen in the Portland area. Most of them have this characteristic tail on their lower hind wing, except for one important exception, which is the Parnassian. Claudius Parnassian is a really beautiful butterfly I've seen in Forest Park, and they tend to be white and then actually get a kind of clear edges to their wings. They're transparent, and they lack that tail. Whites and sulfurs speak for themselves. They tend to be white or yellow in color, kind of medium size, but they can also be larger or smaller. The gossamer winged butterflies is a really large family of some of our smallest butterflies. It includes our coppers, our hair streaks, our blue butterflies, and our metal marks. So I see the echo azure butterfly a lot in the spring here. And they're often brightly colored with green, blues, greens, or coppers, and frequently have checks or dots. And the last family are the brush-footed butterflies. This includes monarchs and painted ladies. There's no single field characteristic to identify this group, but they do have greatly reduced forelegs if you can look that closely at their legs. So here's a list of some common species you're likely to see. I would say personally that the western tiger swallowtail and other swallowtails are the most common native butterflies that I see in the Portland area. They use a lot of broadleaf trees. The Anna swallowtail actually can use things like fennel and things in your garden. Cabbage white is by far the most frequent butterfly I see, which is a little disappointing because you'll see that asterisk. It's a non-native, it's actually considered a pest in agricultural settings. And you'll find it sometimes on plants that you grow in your garden. I found larvae on my kale. So if you watch a little white butterfly showing a lot of interest to non-flowering plants in your garden, that's most likely a cabbage white. There are also West Coast ladies. Sarah's orange tip is a beautiful, kind of simple looking white butterfly, but then it has this characteristic orange at the tip of its forewings. The Echo Azure is a small blue butterfly. Clouded sulfur, Lorquin's admiral is the photo in the upper right that I'm holding. That's a Lorquin's admiral. Woodland skipper, which isn't necessarily something you're going to see very frequently, but sometimes in places in more natural areas, you'll see a woodland skipper later in the season. And then the gray hair streak. So what do butterflies need? They need that host plant to lay their eggs and for their caterpillars to eat and grow up on. They need a safe place to pupate. They need overwintering sites. And depending on the species of butterfly, they can overwinter at any different life stage, egg, larva, pupa, adult. They need nectar sources as adults, and they need protection from pesticides. When we're thinking about host plants and how to pick the right host plant, we really want to think about the species we want to attract. So here's some examples. Monarchs need milkweeds. Skippers typically need native grasses. Our blue butterflies need astragalus, lupins, or other members of the pea family. And painted ladies can use plants like thistles. So when we think about selecting host plants, we really want to focus on native plants. As I mentioned earlier, native butterflies and moths co-evolved with native plants. And there's been great research by Doug Talamay and others. He's got a great book, Bringing Nature Home, that's broader than just insects, but a good read if you want to think about incorporating more wildlife-friendly plantings and design into your yard. And his research has suggested that native plants support 4 times as many native butterflies and moths than as introduced plants. They also tend to be very well adapted for obvious reasons to our local conditions and require fewer pest controls. We also want to not neglect trees. Often when we talk about pollinators, we're thinking about flowering shrubs and forbs, but trees and grasses are also important. Some of the important ones that you could think about incorporating in your landscape are willows, chokecherry, hollyleaf, oak. I'd also add big leaf maple on there. And those are just a few of the ones that they use. And at least 23 butterfly and moth species are known to use oak. What about trying to attract rare and at-risk species? In general, that can be really difficult to achieve unless you know that you're very close by to an existing population. It can be hard if you live in the middle of a city to try and bring in a rare butterfly, even if you plant its host plant. I've been trying my best to bring in Claudius Parnassia into my yard by planting bleeding hearts, but when I just have a few plants and the closest record is 10 miles away, it's unlikely that they're going to show up. So in general, it's best to garden focusing on a broad suite of more common butterflies. The good news when we think about selecting nectar plants, people really focus on red plants or a tube-shaped flower for hummingbirds. But because monarchs have that long proboscis, that long tongue that they use to access nectar, they're quite adaptable with the size and depth of their nectar access. So they can really use a wide variety of flowers. Here's some great examples of native early season blooming plants. We've got Oregon grape in the upper left, and as I move left to right, flowering currant, lupin, ocean spray, willow. You want to get the female willow that'll produce flowers, spirea, Lewis's mock orange. And also, we don't just need to talk about natives. There are definitely some non-natives that are okay. I grew up in the Midwest, so I've got a love for echinacea and coneflower and black-eyed Susan and things that aren't technically native to the Pacific Northwest, but do great in the garden, offer a lot to pollinators, and aren't going to become an issue in natural areas. There's also edible and medicinal plants that are wonderful, mint, thyme, oregano, things that are going to bloom and provide flowers, lavender. They're all great examples of non-natives. Also fruit trees, cherry, apple, things like that. One to avoid is butterfly bush. You'll see it widely planted. Butterflies love it. However, it's really becoming an issue in our natural areas and displacing native plants. And it's actually listed as a noxious weed in Oregon and Washington. So it's best to avoid it. I know that when I go to the nursery and you start to see really attractive names for certain plants, brand names, typically you're wondering about the impact that cultivars might have that aren't strictly native plants, but they've been hybridized or they've been bred to have certain characteristics, and they often have a trademark. These can look really pretty, and there's not necessarily a reason you shouldn't put them in your garden, but when you're thinking about supporting butterflies and other beneficial insects, typically these plants aren't the best because they haven't been bred to produce nectar and pollen at higher amounts, especially trying to avoid the double-petaled varieties that get really hard for these pollinators to access. So there are a lot of wonderful plant lists out there. Xerces has a few different plant lists available on our website that you can check out. But I thought I would just make a little cheat sheet for some great plants that are kind of slam dunks in the Pacific Northwest. Sea blush, California compass plant, and then the next 3, cobwebby thistle, blue blossom, which is also known as theanosis or wild lilac, and showy milkweed are all also host plants for butterflies. I would say that for showy milkweed, like we mentioned, a lot of us are outside of the range of where showy milkweed originally occurred. However, it's not a problem to plant it in a garden setting. Wouldn't be appropriate in a natural area if it doesn't, naturally occur in the area. But I think planting showy milkweed in Seattle is perfectly fine. I wouldn't do it to support monarchs, but it's not a bad thing to do if you want to support other bees and butterflies. And if that rogue monarch shows up, you've gotten really lucky and you've provided something for them. Another, kind of skipping ahead, asters and goldenrod across the board are really wonderful. And there are a lot of hybrid goldenrods out there. So if you want the native kind, look for Solidago canadensis. We also need shelter, not just these plants for pollen and nectar, not just these plants for hosts, but we also need shelter throughout the seasons. So keeping some chaos in your garden is a good thing. Leaving some areas overgrown, including brush piles, bunch grasses, things like that. And the good news is that you're also going to benefit other animals like bumblebees who rely on a lot of these overgrown areas to form their nests. And finally, I'll just briefly go over protection for pesticides. It's obvious to think about avoiding pesticides and spraying products on your lawn or in your garden. But if you do need to use them, minimizing their use, reading the guidance carefully, and still being warned that even if you follow the label instructions, you're not necessarily protecting them from bees or butterflies. Besides spraying pesticides, we also need to think about sourcing the plants we bring onto our properties. Nursery plants are often treated, unfortunately, with systemic insecticides, meaning that they're expressed in all parts of the plant, including the pollen and nectar, including a relatively new class of insecticides you may have heard of called neonicotinoids. And this is a group of pesticides that was really heralded because of its relatively low toxicity to mammals. However, we've learned more and more that it's very, very efficacious against insects, and that includes butterflies. So now neonicotinoids have been strongly linked with declines in a lot of our pollinators. And a recent study by us at Xerces, along with partners at the University of Nevada, Reno, have found high levels of several pesticides in milkweed, including tropical milkweed in this photo. So you can check out Helsch et al. 2020 in Frontiers. It's the full text version is available. And if you have questions, you can follow up and we can send you the link to the article directly. But it was really an eye-opening study because we saw that by either going into the landscape and testing plants or going to a big box store and buying milkweed, that there were such high levels of some of these pesticides that they would kill monarchs. And it really fit with anecdotes that we've received from the public where they say, you know, I purchased this plant to support caterpillars and then I had caterpillars and then they died. And so we have follow-up studies planned, and it also kind of matches work out of the University of Florida by Jarrett Daniels to really think about how, you know, when we go out and buy plants to support pollinators, those plants aren't necessarily free from the poisons that will kill, you know, the larvae and the adults that we're trying to attract. So when possible, try to ask questions at the nursery you shop at, or if you can, you know, seed source or share among neighbors that don't use pesticides, that's a great alternative. The Northwest Center for the Alternative to Pesticides has a really nice link here that I think Karina can put in the chat. It's a list of neonic-free nurseries. They did extensive interviews with nurseries from 2015 to 2017. And so there's a list for nurseries in Oregon and in Washington that do not use neonics. This doesn't mean they don't use some other pesticides, but we know neonics are one of the really bad actors. So that work was completed a few years ago, and I would recommend re-verifying with any nursery on that list that that's still their policy, but it's a great way to kind of, you know, pivot your attention to nurseries that are thinking about this issue. And Xerces will have guidance coming out for consumers to approach nurseries and ask the right questions, and that should be coming out in the next few months. So check back to our website in the future. We're hoping to really start to do a better job of empowering consumers to ask questions and make sure that what they're getting is safe for the butterflies that they bought them to support. And finally, if you are interested in managing pests without pesticides, really thinking about, you know, the old adage that healthy plants spring from healthy soils. And if certain plant isn't working and requires a lot of intervention, maybe that's not the plant for you. Native plants tend to sidestep a lot of those issues. And that some insect pest damage is fine. I know people get really upset when they have aphids and things like that on their milkweeds, and really, you know, aphid damage takes really high level until it's actually going to prevent a plant from reproducing. So trying to learn to tolerate some level of pest damage. And if you have the time, hand picking and using water can be a really effective way and really have no downsides from an environmental perspective. A side note on butterfly houses, like this one pictured. Sometimes you see these for sale, people make them. There's no evidence that these boxes work. There's been a few different studies looking into this and really no evidence that butterflies will occupy this. Butterflies tend to not form, aggregations except for monarchs when they're overwintering, and they don't work there either. So they can be pretty, they'll be occupied potentially by spiders or wasps or bumblebees. They don't do any harm, but we do try to discourage people from thinking that this is a way to support butterflies. So now I just want to show you some really beautiful photos of examples of how people have incorporated pollinator habitat into even small areas. This is a picture. You can see it's just a really small area between the sidewalk and a fence. So started by seed, taken in downtown Seattle. It's a picture of a lawn in Port Townsend, Washington. That yellow and white flower is Douglas's meadow foam, which is a really beautiful plant and attracts a lot of native bees and butterflies and reseeds itself quite readily. This is a patch of my yard. When we moved in a year ago, there were daffodils and mulch and not much else in this corner. So I wanted to start from perennials. I didn't want to have to remove all of that mulch and put in seed. So I added in lavender, which is not native, but it smells great, and I get a lot of pollinators. You also see that showy milkweed starting to bloom in the background, coreopsis, a native geranium. I have bee balm. So I've got kind of this mix of medicinal, native, and more native to the eastern United States pollinator plants in this small patch. Here's another yard in Portland, Oregon. This is actually, despite the abundance that you see, just that small strip between your sidewalk and your curb. So in a small area, this person has lupin and coreopsis really taking over and performing, a huge service for a really small square footage utilized. Here's an example of a pollinator garden started from a seed mix down in Corvallis, Oregon. This is the second year. So interesting, when I talked to my friend Tyson, whose garden this is, he said that the first year, they had a really different species mix. And so when you've got annuals and perennials in a mix, you're gonna see things change from year to year, especially if you mow it or do other things to manage it. So this will kind of continue to evolve in the future as different perennials get more established. And our final example of a garden is in Eugene, Oregon. You'll see some nice checker mallow and then beautiful California poppies. California poppies offer pollen, so bumblebees really love California poppies, but they're not a great butterfly plant. All right, we have our final poll. So this will help inform kind of what we talked about today and what we should maybe do differently the next time. So I'll just bring this up. So what topic did you learn the most about in today's webinar? All right, we've got a lot of people who have voted, so I'm going to close it. All of the above was our most frequent answer, along with the types of flower and nectar plants and the butterflies you can expect to attract to your garden. All right, thanks for participating. So I'm going to wrap up this last section on where to learn more. Cannot do this justice in a short webinar, but the book I recommend the most is Butterflies of the Pacific Northwest by Robert Michael Pyle and Caitlin LeBar. This book is an update of Bob Pyle's 2002 book, Butterflies of Cascadia. It's from the publisher Timber Press, and it was the winner of the 2018 National Outdoor Book Award, and it includes really detailed profiles and pictures of all of our species in the Pacific Northwest. So if you really want a one-stop guide for our area, this is the book to get. I would also say that the range maps are really helpful. 200 still sounds like a lot of butterflies to learn, but if you kind of compared your range maps for your area, I'm sure you could whittle that down and really think about, maybe the 50 to 100 butterflies that could be found in your specific part of the world, and then focus on learning those. Other great books to consider for gardening by Aline Stark, there's Real Gardens Grow Natives. From us at Xerces, there's Gardening for Butterflies. There's really detailed plant profiles. So if you really want to learn more about host plants or nectar plants that are great for butterflies, I think this is the book to get. It's not Pacific Northwest specific, but there's regional information, so you can definitely start to kind of narrow down and make sure that you've got what's most applicable for your area. And then if you want to really nerd out and start to identify caterpillars and eggs, you can learn about the life histories of all the butterflies in the Pacific Northwest with life histories of Cascadia butterflies by David James and David Nunnally, who are both lepidopterists in Washington. If you want to participate in community science, Butterflies and Moths of North America has some really great maps. I use their website a lot. eButterfly, where you can also report observations. And then iNaturalist, which I think is just a great catch-all app for kind of anything you want to report or learn more about. And if you're still interested in monarchs and milkweed, if I haven't convinced you otherwise, I think we can be interested in both. Check out the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, which is a community science project started by Xerces along with partners like the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have comprehensive mapping of monarchs and milkweeds across the Western U.S. Also a lot of free resources to download from Xerces. In the lower left, that Maritime Northwest pollinator plant list is really a go-to if you want a one-stop shop for pollinator plants to plant. Those aren't necessarily just for butterflies. There's some plants on there that are a little more focused on bees, but they split things up by the size of the plant. It's growing requirements, when it's going to bloom, things like that. We also have a lot more information if you want to establish a pollinator meadow from seed, if you want to think about reducing pesticides in your garden, or you really want to dive deep on a certain group of animals like bumblebees, or even a non-pollinator like freshwater mussels. And finally, our YouTube channel will have this webinar and many other webinars. We're going to be growing that library as we move forward, and continue to check out our webinar series. We're having one of these regularly. And so with that, I would just like to say thank you. Thank you for being part of the solution and helping to bring back the butterflies. And I'm looking forward to answering some questions now in our Q&A.
All right, thank you so much, Emma. That was really great. We do have some questions that have come in, but just a quick note, if you do need to leave now, you'll notice an evaluation form pop up in your browser, and we ask that you use that form to provide any feedback you have on today's presentation. So I will just start reading off some of these questions in order. One of the first questions was wondering what the difference is between pollinator and nectar plants.
Yeah, that's a great question. When we say a pollinator plant, that could mean that that plant is providing resources, including nectar, which butterflies rely on for energy, as do bees. It could include pollen, which bees would be actively using as food. Butterflies move more incidentally. They're not consuming pollen on purpose. Or a pollinator plant could also mean a host plant. So pollinator plant is kind of a catch-all. There's some element of this plant that's beneficial for some pollinators. And when I talk about a nectar plant, I'm talking about a plant that provides nectar, which means it's useful for adult bees and butterflies.
All right, perfect. There was also someone who wanted you to expand a little more, if you could, about reasons to avoid butterfly bush. Was there anything else you had to add?
Yeah, I would say that, its potential, and it's what we're realizing is it actually starts to invade natural areas. so it's becoming kind of an active weed is its main issue. So when we think about, supporting our native ecosystems, we don't want to be introducing plants that are going to spread and take over. An example, if you're familiar with it, it's more of an issue in Eastern Washington and Oregon, but Russian olive is really effectively taken over disturbed areas of our waterway banks, and they suck up a ton of water, and they totally change kind of the hydrology of an area, and they outcompete other plants. So, a plant that was kind of introduced and seemed like a good thing ends up taking over, and that crowds out a lot of other plants. So definitely think about butterfly bush as something, to not plant. And if you have it, to consider removing and replacing with something else. I have read, and I don't know enough about this to speak definitively, but I saw here in Portland, the Portland nursery only sells seedless varieties. It does seem like there are some that don't reproduce. So I don't want to speak to that. Wholesale is a good idea, but it does seem like people are thinking a bit about this, and there might be some that are sterile and aren't going to become a problem.
All right, and we have a couple other questions about specific plants as well. Someone is asking how they can get cob webby thistle and several sunflowers to attract butterflies.
Yeah, I think for sourcing, from any particular buyer, Xerces can't promote any specific place. So I think, trying to source from whichever nursery you're familiar with, calling and asking where, what they have. And if they don't have it, thinking about, especially if it's more of a retail nursery, where they source their native plants from. So if you notice when you walk around their native plant section that, wow, they're getting a lot of their plants, they're not propagating them in-house, they're getting them from X, nursery that's maybe more wholesale. Calling those wholesale nurseries can be a good idea directly. Sometimes retailers, for things like thistle, which is not typically a popular plant, although we'd like to change that. There's a lot of great native thistles, and non-native thistles give them a bad rap. You need to talk to those wholesale nurseries directly. I don't know, I haven't tried to purchase cobwebby thistle myself, so I'd be curious how that goes for them. And same with, native sunflowers. Another idea, if you have the time and, kind of gumption, I think, is to try and just keep an eye out on the landscape for those plants and, figure out how you ask permission to collect seed. So I know I've done that with milkweed, where I found roadside populations and then sprouted them myself, and that's been fun, a fun project to learn to propagate.
Yeah, and speaking of milkweed, someone made a comment about swamp milkweed being good for areas west of the mountains. Can that be applied to all regions west of the mountains?
Swamp milkweed is not very widely distributed. Yeah, we definitely have it in Oregon and in Washington, but I don't know, for any particular natural area west, you'd have to kind of look at its range map and the right habitat. But yeah, it is native to our state, so in general, that's fine. But I guess we sometimes make a distinction between what a home gardener does and what we might recommend for a natural area. So from a home gardening perspective, I think you're totally right. Swamp milkweed can be great. But for some of our other, other projects, we try to be a little bit more careful about, getting the right plant from the right area.
All right. And then we have a question here. Do butterflies overwinter in the Pacific Northwest?
They do. It's kind of incredible. It just depends on the species at what life stage they overwinter. But, some of our blues overwinter as larvae. They just kind of nestle really deep onto their host plant near the ground. Some butterflies overwinter as adults under tree bark. Some overwinter as pupa. And, for other species like monarchs, they migrate and they overwinter in, warmer locales like the beaches of California. And then other animals that kind of we see these big profusions like California tortoiseshells, they can't overwinter up here. So once they do well in California, they spread out. And so we're seeing, we're seeing their expanse, but then they're going to die up here. They're not going to make it back. They're not going to do a true migration. They're not going to successfully overwinter. So it kind of depends on the butterfly. But yes, a lot of our native butterfly species do overwinter locally.
Great. And then some more about plants. Should we cluster nectar plants together in the garden?
Yeah, there's definitely some research suggesting that, having clumps of a single plant makes it easier for pollinators to find them versus, having things kind of evenly scattered. So clumping is generally thought as a good thing. It's not a single rule. And so depending on kind of what you're aiming for in your garden, if you're using, a seed mix, you can't really achieve that clumping. But if you're using, perennial starts, something like that, you could certainly create the clumping. And also that can be like just nice visually to kind of create some kind of differentiation that you don't just have like a single mix. So yes, in general, that's a really good point. Clumping can be a great strategy, but the size of the clumping and the importance of it, I think, depends on the plant and the pollinator. We know that like for milkweed, monarchs actually do better on a couple stems of milkweed. Smaller clumps are better than larger clumps, which is kind of counterintuitive, but there's kind of complex interactions with predators where if you have a large patch of milkweed, the science suggests that predators do a better job of finding and eating those caterpillars versus more isolated clumps of plants. So there's some really interesting like factors that I think we can't measure necessarily with the human eye and that kind of affect the whole life cycle. So I guess the answer is yes, and yet it's also a bit more complicated.
Okay, and there's a question about the life cycle of butterfly eggs and larvae on host plants. This person is wondering if they cut down plants in the late fall, will that disturb any eggs or larvae for the following spring?
Yeah, it's a really good question. In general, if you can leave things standing until late spring, that's ideal. But depending on, the area you're working with, you may want to cut things down. So if you are going to do that, you could be disturbing things. So the best thing to do is to just create a brush pile nearby. I've done this with like my raspberry canes and, a few other things where like I do need to trim things, but I know that, let's say a native bee could have tunneled in and be overwintering in that hollow stemmed plant. So I just stack them nearby and don't disturb them. I think definitely if you throw them in the compost bin, that might be okay, just depending on how active your compost bin is. If you throw it into the compost bin for the city, that might be the end of that animal's life. And things like burning, obviously, you're going to destroy that. But if you cut and can leave it somewhat locally, that's not a bad idea if you do really feel like that's what you want to do aesthetically or for other reasons.
Okay, and then we have a successful gardener that is wondering if it's important for them to plant both nectar and host, even though they've been noticing that all of their host plants are fulfilling insect needs.
Yeah, I think I follow that. Definitely a lot of the plants that provide nectar are beneficial to a wide variety of pollinators. So if you don't necessarily have room for like some of the host plants we may have talked about, especially like trees and shrubs, that's okay. You're still doing, great work providing nectar, and you can have those butterflies move, those bees move, and maybe they can overwinter in your neighbor's yard. But I think if you want to have caterpillars, if you want to have the full life cycle, within the realm that you're controlling, that's where, including those host plants can be a great way to make sure you're supporting the entire life cycle for different animals.
All right, and then there's a question if you recommend any particular host plants for small spaces and small urban gardens.
Yeah, that's a good question. Let me look at my little cheat sheet. was talking about this with some folks the other day, and I think some of the ones that, that would be really good, really, I do think showy milkweed does pretty well. You could keep that actually in like a large pot or a small area. Yeah, obviously you're probably going to want to avoid kind of the trees and shrubs that are going to get really big. Lupins, I have a riverbank lupin that's taken over my garden and is larger than most of my shrubs, so I would steer away from that if you have a really small space. But some of our other lupins can be a host for blues, so that one's not that bad in terms of size. Looking back down here, actually some of the host plants, like fennel that supports anise swallowtails would do really well in a small space and is not necessarily a perennial. Native roses can host plants, can host butterflies and stay relatively small. So those would be some ideas. Looking down my list. I hope that's a good start. I think that definitely, thinking about if you are multi-purposing, if there are edible plants that are hosts, that can be a great way to kind of get both and staying away from those shrubs and those trees.
All right. And I did send out a couple links to pollinator plant lists and nectar plant lists in our area. So you could definitely check out our publications on our website for more plant lists. And then I think we have time for a few more questions. Someone is wondering if clover lawns are a good trend.
I think so. Clover can be a host plant. Seems somewhat unlikely if you're mowing it, in a lawn setting, but I know I'm letting my lawn turn into mostly clover, and I think that's okay. I think a benefit of clover is also that it fixes nitrogen, so it can be a good way to build soil health. But in general, what we usually have for our lawn species are a monoculture of non-native grasses that aren't supporting almost anything. So clover, I think, is a slightly better plant in that it fixes nitrogen, and in theory could be hosting, some animals if you really weren't mowing that frequently. And there's also great examples. I know someone else at work is experimenting with a flowering short-statured lawn mix. So it's not necessarily native plants, but again, lawns aren't usually native. So they're putting in things that they don't have to mow and that will flower. So I know they're in their first year of that, but I think that's an interesting trend too, beyond clover. Obviously, clover can bloom as well if you're not mowing too often, and then it does provide nectar resources. So I think anything that can kind of take over and isn't like a noxious weed and can flower, can, fix nitrogen, are generally an improvement over Kentucky bluegrass.
Are you familiar with any specific types of clover that would be good to seed?
Yeah, I mean, my lawn, white clover is taking over, tends to be smaller. Our larger, like red clovers, tend to get kind of large. I don't know how well that would work in a lawn. I don't know how well it would bounce back from like aggressive mowing. So I think our short-statured clovers are a good idea. They're not native, but they tend to do well. And I found they do a little bit better in our dry summers. I found that like our clover patches in our lawn, stay greener a little bit longer without water.
Okay, and there's a question about seed mixes and if folks should trust native seed mixes or if most of them are full of invasive or foreign species.
Yeah, I would hope that any seed mix that claims it's native has done its due diligence, but it's never not a bad idea to double check. I definitely get a little concerned when I've looked at like some of the seed catalogs that I really enjoy for sourcing vegetables, and they'll have one pollinator seed mix they claim is native, for like half of the United States, and there's just no way that every single plant in a mix, covering a 20 state area is actually native to that specific state. So I think thinking about the regionality of the seed mix and what they're claiming, doing a quick Google search of those scientific names is a good idea. And one thing people don't often think about, but it can be important, is that, having some component of native grasses can be really valuable. We often think about just forbs, but native grasses are also important hosts, and that other person's question about small spaces, native bunch grasses are a great idea for a really small space. I just planted some Romer's fescue and it's really small. Idaho fescue are good examples. So I think looking at those seed mixes, seeing if there's a good native grass component can be one good thing. If it's all forbs, that's okay. But if you look them up and they're all annuals, you may also want to think about what you really want. And all annual plants, you're probably going to be having a lot of changeover from year to year. And if you've got a lot, a really perennial heavy mix, it may take longer to that establish. You may have more weed pressure. So sometimes those native mixes, you want to really think about what you want to achieve and then what those plants that are in there, how they're going to do. And frankly, some plants that they put in seed mixes, you're never going to see because other things are just going to outcompete them. So sometimes, it's best to put out a seed mix that's maybe heavy in the annuals or the biennials and fast growing perennials, fast establishing perennials. And then you can maybe go back in and add plugs of some other perennials that you want. Sometimes it's hard from a single seed mix to get everything you want.
All right, and then we did have a question about different species of native thistles that you would recommend. And I did send over a native thistles conservation practitioner's guide, but just wondering, Emma, if you know of any other native thistles off the top of your head.
Yeah, edible thistle is one that I saw for the first time last summer, just outside of Ecola Beach State Park near Cannon Beach. And it's a really beautiful native thistle. So it's Cercium edual. It's kind of like the word edible, but eduum. And that's a really nice one and a lot of activity. Thistles, butterflies love thistles. They're kind of incredible. Even non-native, when I've done field work in Nevada, when like non-native thistle is the only thing around blooming, on some of our BLM lands in really arid areas, thistle is like the magnet. So it takes a little bit of work. It's not the most popular plant yet, but I do think if you can find a source, native thistles are a really great addition to your garden.
Great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end it there because we're all out of time. If we didn't get to your question or you think of a follow-up that has to do with gardening for butterflies, you can reach out to us by visiting our website, which is xerces.org. We also have a contact and staff page so you can reach a specific department, and also a frequently asked questions page where you can find many resources. Or if you'd prefer to call us, you can call our main line and dial 123 for my extension, and I'll help you out. And thanks again to Emma and to Lenore and to all of you watching today for making this possible. Have a great rest of your day.